Okay, ready to dive into something kind of wild?
Always up for a wild ride. What are we looking at today?
So, chemtrails.
Ah, right.
Yeah, you know that whole thing about planes spraying stuff into the atmosphere?
The ever-popular topic of climate engineering.
Exactly. Some folks are convinced it's already happening. They're like, look up, those aren't just contrails,
It's a topic that definitely sparks a lot of debate.
to say the least. So we're doing a deep dive digging into The Dimming. You know that documentary? We'll be looking at interviews with experts, even getting into some heated forum discussions.
Sounds thorough.
Gotta be thorough. This topic's got layers, like an onion. Speaking of The Dimming, that documentary kicks things off with a bang, claiming there's this huge global effort to, well, dim the sun.
Their central claim is that governments are already spraying reflective particles into the atmosphere. It's called solar radiation management.
Solar radiation management.
Yeah, SRM for short. Basically, it's an attempt to combat climate change by reducing the amount of sunlight that reaches the Earth's surface.
Like giving the planet sunglasses.
Precisely.
Wild.
The documentary focuses heavily on Dane Wigington, a former solar energy entrepreneur.
Right, I read about him. He's the one who noticed less sunlight was hitting his solar panels, right?
Exactly. He was initially skeptical, but that observation got him digging into weather data, patents, the whole 9 yards. That's how he got sucked into the world of climate engineering.
And The Dimming really lays out the supposed evidence. Persistent contrails, photos of planes with what look like modified nozzles. They even talk about lab tests showing elevated levels of aluminum in rainwater.
They spend a good chunk of the film focusing on those airplane photos. They claim those modified nozzles are designed specifically for spraying aerosols.
Those pictures were pretty convincing, I have to admit.
They're definitely presented in a way that's meant to be compelling, but without context, it's tough to say for sure what those photos actually show.
Okay, so you're saying there could be a perfectly innocent explanation.
Possibly. I've seen aviation experts debunk those photos, claiming they're just standard aircraft features, like fuel venting systems, taken completely out of context.
So it's like we need to fact-check the evidence itself.
Exactly. That's the tricky thing with this topic. Separating actual evidence from speculation and misinterpretations, it's a real challenge.
It's like trying to assemble a puzzle, but some of the pieces might be from a different box.
That's a great analogy, and that's where critical thinking becomes absolutely crucial.
For sure. But, okay, let's say for a second that some of this evidence does hold up. The documentary makes a big deal about aluminum. They're claiming it's showing up in places it shouldn't be and in forms that could be dangerous to humans.
Aluminum is their smoking gun. They focus on the idea that while aluminum is naturally occurring, it's usually in a bound form, meaning it's not easily absorbed by the body. What they're worried about is bioavailable aluminum, which can be.
And they claim this bioavailable aluminum is linked to all sorts of health problems, right? Alzheimer's even.
That's the argument they're making. They link it to neurotoxicity, suggesting it could be a factor in various neurological disorders.
And then there's that whole thing about them finding elevated levels of aluminum in remote areas, like
Yeah.
way out in the middle of nowhere.
That's a key part of their claim. If there's aluminum in places it shouldn't be, and in a form that's potentially harmful, well, that raises the question of where it's coming from.
It's like they're saying it's raining aluminum.
Essentially, yes.
Hmm.
Their argument is that this points to those deliberate spraying programs rather than, say, natural occurrences or industrial pollution.
Okay, but here's where I get a little lost. If they're trying to cool the planet, wouldn't they use something that reflects sunlight really, really well?
You're thinking about albedo, the reflectivity of a surface. And you're right, it's a crucial factor. Some proponents of climate engineering believe that aluminum oxide nanoparticles would be ideal for solar radiation management because of their high reflectivity.
Aluminum oxide nanoparticles.
Exactly. Tiny particles of aluminum oxide, a highly reflective substance. Plus, they don't clump together easily, which means they could remain suspended in the atmosphere for longer periods.
Okay, so is it possible that some of what the documentary attributes to spraying could actually just be like normal aluminum, just, in slightly different forms?
It's a possibility. Aluminum is the third most abundant element in the Earth's crust, so it's not as if it's completely foreign to our environment.
True, true. But what about those potential health risks? Are they overstating that part?
The potential health effects of nanoparticles, particularly those that are engineered, are definitely an area of active scientific investigation. There's still a lot we don't know.
So it's not just a fringe concern then.
Not at all. And I think that's something that often gets lost in the more sensationalized aspects of this whole chemtrail debate. There are legitimate questions about the safety and ethical implications of messing with the atmosphere on such a massive scale, even if the intention is to address climate change.
Right, because even with good intentions, things could go very, very wrong.
Exactly. And it's not just about spraying aluminum. The dimming also touches on other aspects of climate engineering, like cloud seeding.
Oh yeah, cloud seeding. Isn't that where they like make it rain on demand?
Pretty much. They use substances like silver iodide to encourage cloud formation and precipitation.
Which on the surface doesn't sound all that bad. Farmers do it all the time, right?
They do. It's a common practice in drought-prone areas, but the documentary suggests it could be used for much more than just making it rain for crops.
Like what?
Well, for one, they suggest it could be used to manipulate weather patterns, potentially even weaponizing them.
Okay, now we're getting into some real X-Files territory.
Yeah.
But seriously, is there any evidence to back up that claim, or is it pure speculation?
The documentary points to things like accusations from Iran that NATO has been engaging in weather warfare.
Weather warfare, as in using the weather as a weapon. Wow. Okay, so even if we set aside the intentional nefarious stuff for a moment, we're still talking about the potential for humans to impact the atmosphere in ways that we don't fully understand.
Precisely.
And that's where things get really complicated. And honestly, a bit scary.
It is concerning
Yeah.
because even if some of these activities seem relatively harmless on their own, their cumulative impact on the environment could be significant. We simply don't know enough yet.
It's like we're adding all these ingredients to the atmosphere, but we don't have the recipe, so we have no idea what we're actually cooking up.
That's a chilling way to put it, but you're not wrong.
And the dimming doesn't exactly shy away from painting a pretty grim picture of what those consequences could be.
No, they don't. They outline some pretty dire possibilities.
Okay, so no sugarcoating it, lay it on us. What's the worst case scenario here? What are we talking about? So we've got potential ozone damage, messed up weather patterns. What else? What's the worst that could happen if this dimming is real? And especially like if it goes wrong.
The documentary uses a term that's pretty scary: termination shock. Imagine we're relying on this artificial shield, this dimming of the sun, right? And then for whatever reason, it stops. Suddenly, boom, we're facing the full force of like decades of pent-up climate change all at once.
Oh, wow. So it's not just that the dimming itself is bad, it's that stopping it could be catastrophic.
Exactly. Think runaway temperature increases, superstorms, the works. It's a stark reminder that even if we were to consider these large-scale interventions, we're essentially hitching ourselves to them permanently.
Okay, that's some seriously heavy stuff. But I do have to ask, and maybe this is my skeptical side talking, but if things are this bad, if there's all this evidence, why aren't more people talking about this? Like, why isn't it bigger news?
Well, you did bring up that forum, MetaBunk, where there were some pretty strong dissenting voices.
Right.
They would say that the dimming is just really good at, connecting dots that aren't meant to be connected.
Right, like those contrails that linger. They'd say that's just normal atmospheric conditions.
Yeah.
Or those elevated aluminum levels, that could just be from regular industrial pollution, right?
Exactly. And to be fair, it's not entirely unreasonable. We do have to account for the fact that there's already a lot of pollution up there.
Yeah.
So it's like, how do we know for sure what's intentional climate engineering and what's just, well, humanity making a mess as usual?
Right, yeah.
It's a tough one.
It is. It's a tough one. And without more transparency, it's hard to even know where to begin. Speaking of transparency, that whole part in the documentary with Dane Wigington confronting that geoengineering advocate, Dr. David Keith, intense.
Oh, yeah. That was a tense moment for sure. You could just feel the tension in the air when Wigington pressed him about the lack of research on the toxicity of aluminum and nanoparticles.
And Keith's response, or like lack thereof, wasn't exactly reassuring. It almost felt like he was dodging the question.
It definitely highlighted the concerns that a lot of people have about the precautionary principle, Shouldn't we be absolutely sure that something is safe before we start pumping it into the atmosphere?
Right. Especially when we're talking about potentially harming the health of, like, billions of people. And Wigington was adamant that aluminum in its nanoparticle form is not something to be messed with. He even said it doesn't occur naturally in that free reactive state.
He made a compelling case, especially when he talked about how aluminum, when it is naturally present, is usually bound to other elements, which makes it relatively harmless.
Yeah. And he had that whole stack of research showing how aluminum can mess with plant root systems. He even suggested it could be linked to the collapse of bee colonies.
Right. He presented a lot of information, especially when he talked about those closed-door meetings he claimed to attend, with environmental agencies.
Oh, right, where they were seeing those massive spikes in aluminum levels, but keeping it all hush-hush.
Exactly. That lack of transparency just feeds into the suspicion, doesn't it?
It totally does. And it wasn't just the government that he called out. I was actually shocked when he criticized those big environmental groups like Greenpeace for not taking a stronger stance against climate engineering.
That was an interesting point. His claim was that those groups are too afraid of jeopardizing their funding to take on an issue that's so controversial.
Which, if it's true, is kind of a messed up situation.
Yeah.
Like, are they more concerned about their own survival than the potential risks?
It definitely raises questions about whose voices get heard in these debates and who gets to decide what is considered credible. And I think Wigington, even if some of his claims seem far-fetched, at least brings those questions to light.
Yeah, he does. He's certainly not afraid to ruffle some feathers. But it's not like he's just complaining. He actually offers solutions.
Yeah.
I mean, love him or hate him, you have to admire his dedication to getting the word out about climate engineering and pushing for transparency in public debate.
He definitely tapped into something important there, because even in that Economist video we watched, where they discussed solar geoengineering, there was a strong emphasis on the need for open democratic decisions about these technologies.
Oh, yeah, that's right. They argued that even the research itself shouldn't be done in secret because it might embolden governments to just go ahead and deploy these technologies without any public oversight.
Right. And then there's the whole geopolitical can of worms this opens up. Like, who controls the thermostat of the planet? What happens when one country's solution to climate change negatively impacts another?
It's like the ultimate tragedy of the commons, except in this case, the commons is the entire planet.
Exactly. The stakes are incredibly high.
This is giving me chills.
This, in a thought-provoking way, of course, not like in a scary way. Well, maybe a little bit of a scary way. It is a lot to process, but I think the key takeaway is that these aren't just hypothetical sci-fi scenarios anymore. We're talking about real technologies with very real and potentially very significant implications. And we need to be having these conversations. We need to be thinking critically about the potential risks and benefits.
Absolutely. It's not enough to just leave it to the scientists and the politicians to sort it all out, right?
Yeah.
But what can we as individuals even do? I mean, it seems like such a massive, complicated issue.
Yeah, it can feel kind of overwhelming. Like, how do we even begin to wrap our heads around something as big as, like, intentionally engineering the entire planet's climate?
It's a fair point. It feels so far out of our individual control.
Right, like, what can I possibly do about it? But I guess the documentary argues that's exactly what they want us to think, right?
Well, that's a common thread in these types of narratives, the idea that powerful forces are working to keep the public in the dark.
Which, I have to admit, can make it hard to separate genuine concern from, like, full-blown paranoia.
Absolutely. It's a delicate balance. Okay, so let's say, for the sake of argument, that some form of climate engineering is actually on the table. What are we even talking about here? Are we talking about, like, building giant space mirrors to reflect sunlight, or seeding the oceans with iron?
Those are all ideas that have been floated, but one of the most widely discussed proposals is something called stratospheric aerosol injection, or SAI for short.
Stratospheric aerosol injection.
Yeah, it's a mouthful.
It sounds intense. What's that all about?
Basically, it involves spraying reflective particles into the stratosphere, the layer of the atmosphere above the one we live in, to block out a portion of incoming sunlight.
So it's like giving the planet sunglasses, but on a massive scale.
Exactly. And it's actually modeled after a natural phenomenon. Remember when Mount Pinatubo erupted back in 1991?
Vaguely, yeah.
Well, that eruption released massive amounts of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. And those particles actually had a measurable cooling effect on the planet for a couple of years.
Oh, wow. So they're basically trying to copy what a volcano does, but like intentionally?
Precisely. But of course, as you can imagine, it's a highly controversial idea.
I bet. I mean, even if it works, messing with the stratosphere like that just can't be good, right? What about the ozone layer?
That's one of the major concerns. There's still a lot we don't know about the potential side effects of SAI. Some models suggest it could disrupt rainfall patterns, leading to droughts in certain regions.
Right. Solve one problem, create a whole bunch of new ones. Classic.
It's a gamble with potentially huge consequences. And that's precisely why even many proponents of SAI argue that it should only be considered as an absolute last resort and only after extensive research and careful consideration of the risks.
Okay, so that's the big, scary, potentially planet-altering technology on the horizon. But what about the stuff that's supposedly happening right now? Dane Wigington and folks like him seem pretty convinced that the spraying is already happening. They point to those lab tests, those eyewitness accounts. He even claims to have, infiltrated these high-level government meetings where they're talking about it.
Right. It's important to remember that Wigington presents a particular perspective. And while he might be raising some valid concerns, it's important to maintain a healthy degree of skepticism.
Right, right. Like that whole thing with the photos of the airplane wings with those supposed spray nozzles. Turns out those could just be totally normal aircraft features, just taken out of context.
Exactly. It's about looking at the bigger picture, considering alternative explanations, and not jumping to conclusions.
Okay, so maybe pump the brakes a little on the whole global spraying conspiracy thing. But what about, cloud seeding? That's a real thing, right? We're not making that up, are we?
No, cloud seeding is definitely a real thing. It's been around for decades. Basically, it involves introducing particles, often silver iodide, into clouds to encourage precipitation.
So it's like making it rain for a football game, but on a much, much larger scale.
Pretty much, yeah. It's used for everything from drought mitigation to hail suppression.
Okay. But the dimming kind of hinted that it could be used for shadier purposes too, like even weaponized. Is that something we should actually be concerned about?
The potential for misuse is certainly there, and there have been accusations, for example, from Iran, that weather modification technologies have been used in military contexts.
Okay, yeah, now that's a bit unsettling. Are there any international laws or anything stopping countries from just, turning the weather into a weapon?
There are international treaties that prohibit the hostile use of environmental modification techniques,
Okay, good.
but these agreements are largely based on good faith, and they can be difficult to enforce.
So it's yeah, we all promise not to weaponize the weather, unless we really want to.
Unfortunately, that's the reality of it. And it highlights the complexities of these technologies and the crucial need for strong international cooperation and oversight. Because one country's attempt to engineer its way out of a climate crisis could have devastating unintended consequences for the rest of the world.
A lot to think about.
It really is.
So, okay, we've covered a ton of ground here, and I think if there's one thing I'm taking away from this deep dive, it's that this stuff is complicated, really, really complicated. But what does it all mean for the average person? What can we actually do about any of this?
Well, for one, don't check out of the conversation because it feels too big or too complex. The first step is simply staying informed and engaged.
Right. Don't just take our word for it, or even Dane Wigington's.
Exactly. Read up on the science, explore different perspectives, and form your own conclusions.
And, if you're concerned about something, speak up. Talk to your friends, your family, write to your elected officials. Support organizations that are working on these issues.
Because these aren't just academic debates anymore. These are decisions that will impact the future of our planet. And we all deserve a say in how those decisions are made.
Well said. So there you have it, folks. A deep dive into the world of climate engineering. We covered the potential benefits, the potential risks, the conspiracy theories, and the very real ethical questions that these technologies raise.
It's a topic that's full of uncertainty, but one thing is for sure, it's a conversation that's only going to become more important in the years to come.
Absolutely. So keep your eyes on the skies, keep asking those tough questions, and let's all work together to ensure a future where we're not just reacting to crises, but proactively shaping a world that's sustainable and just for all.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those brains buzzing.